course of my life, there were only three things that I ever really wanted to be when I grew up. When I was small, I wanted to be an astronaut. I wanted to travel into space and explore the universe. Then, I wanted to be a filmmaker. I think I was just in love with the idea of stories, storytelling, and story making. Unfortunately, as it came to being a filmmaker, I was more in love with the idea of being a filmmaker than I was in love with the actual act of making movies. But eventually, this evolved into wanting to be an English teacher. I was 15 years old when I saw Dead Poet Society in 1989, and John Keating's message that thoughts, words, and ideas can change the world resonated with me. I wanted to be that pithy intellectual who had seemingly read everything and had some remarkable insight into the human condition. But once I actually got into the classroom, I realized that being an intellectual isn't enough. You need something else. You need a shield. In my life and on my blog, I call this teacher armor. Teaching taught me who I am. It taught me patience, and it taught me how to handle adversity. But most importantly, it taught me how to put on a brave face. It took me a while to build my teacher armor. In this business, there's a commonly held belief that unless you're some kind of wunderkind, you really suck at this job for the first 5 years or so. Basically, you're still learning the craft. My content knowledge was never the issue with me, but my classroom management, that was a hole in my game. My problem was I tried too hard to be my students' friend. It took me a little while to realize that you can be friendly with your students without being one of their friends. I vividly remember my principal in South Carolina, Doc, as he told all of us staff members of his to call him. He was an old school Southern guy. I don't want to necessarily call him a good old boy because there's a lot of implications with being a good old boy, but knowing Doc as I did, I wouldn't be surprised if he wasn't a legit good old boy. Anyway, one day we were having a conversation in his office. Now, I can't remember if this was after having some sort of disciplinary issue that I was dealing with, or if it was maybe after one of his observations in my classroom and he just wanted to kind of share his notes and reflections with me. But anyway, he pulled me aside, and in his southern drawl that sounds a little bit kind of like a Texas accent, or at least how this Great Lakes guy thinks that a northern accent would sound, he said, "Rob, every now and then you need to hang a dead carcass outside of the wigwam to let the natives know that you mean business." I was stunned. His choice of words, totally inappropriate. But his point was 100% correct. As a leader, you have to set a tone. You have to make an example out of your subordinates or your employees or your students, your charges, however you want to call them in any case. I didn't know how to do that back then. But after a few years, I ended up moving back to Michigan, as I have relayed that story several times already on this podcast and on the blog. Now, I want to be clear about what I mean when I say teacher armor. It's a term that you won't find in any college of education textbook. They teach you pedagogy, they teach you curriculum, they teach you methods, they even teach you adolescent psychology. They'll even teach you how to grade a rubric and to create a rubric, but they don't teach you how to build a steel spine while simultaneously keeping a soft heart. That's really the heart of what teacher armor really is. I don't have to go any further than thinking about a student that I have right now this very semester. I'll call him Q. He lives with legal guardians. Presumably they're not his blood relatives. Anyway, he works a part-time job just to buy food for himself and for his sister. Recently, his hours at his job got cut. The other day, he was talking to my co-teacher, who he's already built up a good rapport with, and he told her straight up, "I've given up eating so I have enough money to get food for my sister." I'm going to say that again. I have given up eating so I have enough money to get food for my sister. In most lines of work, that isn't exactly a Tuesday morning conversation that you'd have with your coworkers around the water cooler. But as a teacher, this is your reality. Thankfully, my co-teacher is able to jump some hurdles and get him to the front of the line at a local food bank. But those are the moments where your teacher armor is forged. You have to be strong enough to solve the problem and empathetic enough to feel the weight of it. And then there was 2020. Nobody was ready for what we all experienced worldwide with the pandemic and the COVID lockdowns. As teachers, we Apollo 13'd the hell out of this entire concept of virtual teaching. In Detroit, we knew that school wasn't just about reading, writing, and arithmetic. It was about survival. We were out there in the parking lots every day, mid-lockdown, distributing meals because our kids still had to eat. And as many of you may or may not know, for a lot of kids, that crappy breakfast and that crappy lunch they get in our crappy cafeteria food is oftentimes the only food many of our students get during the day. I remember one time being in a lesson in one of my virtual classes and a student asking me point blank in a virtual chat, how do you deal with depression? I could have moved her into a private chat, private sidebar where we could have talked one-on-one, but I didn't. I opened up to the whole class. I told them that I deal with anxiety and depression. That's the armor. It's the ability to compartmentalize the fact that when I drive back to the suburbs, my students are still living in what is essentially the killing fields of this country. It's shaping and molding your emotions like a blacksmith until you have something that can protect you without turning you into stone. When I got my job in inner city Detroit, I stood out. Keep in mind, teaching is a field that is predominantly serviced by females. So as a male, I'm already in the minority in my line of work. I wasn't going to shrink. I couldn't hide the fact that I was the only white dude in the building. So I just chose to be myself. When the kids got loud because they felt like they needed to be heard, I got loud right back. But Detroit forced me to thicken that teacher armor that I had already been working on. I had to put on a brave front for students who were dealing with some real heavy stuff. Crime, drugs, and death. This was everyday life for a lot of my students. It was nothing, in fact, for me to have at least one student every year that I taught there who lost everything they owned in a house fire. And who the hell was I? I could hop in my car and be back in the suburb in 10 minutes. I didn't know what my students were going home to or what they were dealing with in their neighborhoods every day and every night. But inside my classroom, that was my house. My classroom became my sanctuary. It was my fortress, and I didn't let anything in that I didn't allow. And if somehow it got through the cracks, I ran it out. Even through the 2020 lockdowns and the civil unrest after George Floyd, I stayed in Detroit. Hell, I took part in a Black Lives Matter march that my school district put on. I had thought that I was a part of the community. I thought that I was that I was established. But after 5 years, my principal reneged on a job offer that she gave me in writing. I could have fought it. I probably could have pitched a fit with my union. She would have, or the district would have been forced to be sure that I still had a position, which eventually they did, but to be honest, I didn't want to work on that school again, and I certainly didn't want to work for that administrator again. Eventually, I landed in my home district, the very district that I went through as a kid. Not only that, but this was also the very first district that I applied to when I first got into teaching. 20 years after that first application, I had finally come home. Now, I don't want to sound like I'm pissing and moaning, but I do think in some ways being a male teacher does present its own unique challenges to young men who are entering this profession. The way I see it, and this is a broad generalization, I know, but male teachers are typically viewed in one of two ways. You are either the touchy-feely, emotional wuss guy, or you are the strict, hard-ass football coach, former football player, type guy who is automatically seen as a threat or an opposition. Early on, I fell into that touchy-feely wuss character. Today, I have students who ask me point blank if I was in the military. They see an intensity in me. They ask me if I played football. Hell, they ask me if I coach football. But they see this intensity, and the truth is, I don't use that to frighten them. But I do use it to let them know that there are times in my classroom and in my school when I am simply not playing around. All of these experiences taught me tenacity. It gave me a greater work ethic than, quite frankly, I realized I ever had. In fact, today, I hate calling in sick. As a teacher, at least for me, it's actually harder to prepare for a substitute teacher to come into my classroom and deal with the aftermath of whatever goes on during the day while they're there than it is for me to just go into work, suck it up for a day, and grind it out. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not the guy who walks in there if I'm bleeding out of my arms and legs, and I do very much believe in mental health days. But the fact is that I run my classroom in a certain way, and students pick up on that. They know when they walk into different classrooms, they know where they can and cannot get away with certain crap at. Any deviation that comes into the manner in which my classroom is run throws off the gravity of the whole situation. You know, there's a reason that I call Saturday the seventh day. It's not just a day off. It's a decompression chamber, going all the way back to when I was a little kid. And I have to say, before I go any further, that a lot of my experiences kind of have just been the same experiences I had as a student, especially since, I went to school as a kid, I went to college, I became a teacher. So in a lot of ways, I know that I built my entire year around the academic calendar. So I think you guys will understand that when I say that Saturday has always felt like the true end of the week. And in fact, if you look at a calendar, Saturday is literally the seventh day of the week. I know we only say the weekend being Saturday and Sunday and look at Monday as a chance to refresh, but Saturday is the actual end of the week. Fridays are just the finish line. Saturdays for me is where I actually stop running. That teacher armor that I talk about, it doesn't just evaporate the second that I clock out on a Friday afternoon. It takes time to unbuckle. It takes time to decompress. If you've spent 5 days being the game face guy, the one that has to have the answers, you can't just flip a switch and go back to a different mode. For me, Saturday is the day that the armor finally comes off. I don't have to be a leader on Saturdays. I can just be quiet. In fact, I'd say it probably takes me the first 2 weeks of my summer vacation just to remember how to be a regular human being. I usually tell people that I spend those first 2 weeks of summer break just decompressing. Saturday is a micro version of that summer break. It's the sound of the armor coming off. If you don't acknowledge the armor that you're wearing, you'll never know why it is that you're so tired. Rebuilding is about choosing when to wear the armor, when to carry the shield, and when to know that it's safe to set it all down. In 2 weeks, we're hitting the home stretch. We'll be discussing the gravity of the finish line as I close in on my 1,000-day milestone. I hope you'll join me for that next episode. This episode of Rebuilding Rob, the podcast, was produced, edited, written, and hosted by yours truly, your favorite blogger, a guy named Rob. I'd like to thank you for tuning in today. I'm well aware that, like me, you have a ton of podcast listening options, so I'm honored that you decided to spend just a little bit of your day here with me. You can find the show wherever you get your favorite podcast. Obviously, you've probably figured that out already, or else you wouldn't be listening to me right now. And if you're interested in more insight into this perfectly ordinary, non-gun-owning white guy, feel free to check out the blog at rebuildingrob.com. So until next time, this is Rob, reminding you to be audacious, be bold, and be brave. Be strong enough to be gentle, and remember, the rebuild never ends. Bye, everybody.